All right, so imagine this. A brilliant spacecraft launches, right? It completes its mission, but then it just stays up there. It turns into orbital junk, a super valuable idea just lost in space. Well, it turns out the exact same thing can happen to powerful research, especially when we're trying to figure out what makes a great leader.
Okay, so let's get into our first big idea here. And no, we're not actually talking about satellites and rockets. We're talking about a special kind of knowledge waste. It's called research debris. So what is that exactly? Well, research debris is basically what happens when all this brilliant academic work just doesn't make it into the real world. It gets published, it's peer-reviewed, it's all very impressive. But instead of actually helping people on the ground, it just gets stuck up there in this kind of intellectual orbit. It's valuable for sure, but it's completely out of reach.
And why does this happen? How does all this debris pile up? Well, there are a few key reasons. For one, you've got academics and you've got practitioners, and honestly, they're often living in completely different worlds. Researchers get rewarded for being super rigorous and theoretical, right? But leaders on the ground, they need solutions that are relevant and now. Then you throw in the whole publish or perish culture in universities, a ton of academic jargon that nobody outside of a library can understand, and a process that often treats leaders like lab rats instead of actual partners.
Okay, so this brings us to a perfect example of potential research debris. And it's a big one, our whole idea of ethical leadership. Let's take a look at how a set of ideas that's supposed to be helpful might actually just be, floating around in orbit. So just take a second and think about it for yourself. When you picture a good, ethical leader, what are the traits that pop into your head? I'm willing to bet it was something kind of like this, right? The books, the articles, they're all just filled with this one ideal. A leader who's decisive, heroic, maybe a little dominant. This is the model we're sold over and over again. This strong, often kind of masculine, very Western idea of what leadership looks like.
But, and this is a big but, there's a huge problem with trying to build a universal model on that one idea.
And here's the kicker. This is the big reveal. The vast majority of that mainstream leadership research, the stuff that gave us that ideal leader, is based on what scientists call weird samples. That stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now get this. That group, the weird societies, they make up less than 5% of the entire world's population. Let that sink in. We've built a supposedly universal model of leadership by pretty much ignoring 95% of humanity.
So how do we even begin to understand leadership in that other 95%? Well, it means we need a totally new way of seeing the world. We have to start looking at it as a place that's just full of competing ideas, or what the research calls competing logics.
Now, the technical term for this tool is institutional logics. I know it sounds a little academic, but it's actually pretty simple. It's really just about seeing the different unwritten rule books that guide our lives. I mean, think about it, right? The rules you follow in the business world are totally different from the rules you follow with your family. And those are different from the rules of your faith or the laws of your country. We're all juggling these different logics every single day. Here's a super simple example to make it clear. You've got market logic, which says prioritize profit, be efficient, win. But then you've got family logic, which says be loyal, take care of your people, relationships matter most. So, what happens when a manager has to lay off a longtime employee who also happens to be a close family friend? All of a sudden, those two logics, those two rule books, are in a head-on collision. And this is exactly the kind of thing leaders in the global south deal with all the time. Take Vietnam during the COVID crisis. Leaders there were totally torn between the market logic that said you have to lay off staff to survive and a really deep cultural logic they called tum. It basically means heart, or your inner moral self, and it carries this powerful obligation to lead with compassion. Or think about Brazil, where the logic of hierarchy, just do what your boss says, smashes right up against legal logic. See, these leaders aren't just making a simple choice. They are navigating this incredible web of competing values that our universal model just completely ignores. Okay, so how on earth are we supposed to make sense of all this complexity? The answer isn't to come up with another rigid, one-size-fits-all model. It's about finding a more flexible framework, really a whole new way of thinking about leadership. And the whole point here isn't about finding some simple, clean answer. It's about developing a lens that helps us see and maybe even appreciate what the research calls the messy reality of organizational life. So let's break this down into 4 simple steps. Step 1, you learn to see the whole system at play. The market, the family, the state, all of it. Step 2, you pinpoint where all those different rule books are competing, or maybe even cooperating. Step 3, and this one is so important, you have to accept that there's usually no single right answer. It's all about tough trade-offs. And finally, step 4, you recognize that leaders aren't just puppets. They have agency. They can interpret these pressures and actively navigate their way through them.
And this brings us right back to where we started. Because by using a framework like this one, we can actually start to prevent all these valuable, complex ideas about leadership from becoming, well, research debris in the first place.
So how do we actually do that? It's all about bridging that gap through collaboration. We're talking about deep, long-term partnerships between the researchers and the people on the ground. It means we need more knowledge brokers, people who are great at translating the academic stuff into practical advice. And it means doing research differently, building theories at the same time as we're solving real-world problems.
And really, the big takeaway here is actually pretty optimistic. As research says, this divide between theory and practice is not an intractable chasm, but a dynamic and paradoxical space that can be navigated. It's not a hopeless gap. It's a space we can absolutely get across, but it's going to take real intention and a totally new way of working together.
And that really just leaves us with one last question to think about. No matter what you do, whether you're in business or science or anything else, there are great ideas all around you. So the question is, for you, how can you be a bridge? How can you help translate and connect and put good ideas to work so they don't just end up as another piece of debris floating just out of reach?